offenders. At the weekend, the Prime Minister announced a new national inquiry will hold institutions which failed victims to account. Baroness Casey initially didn't back a national inquiry, but explains why she changed her mind.
When they said, we'll put some money into 5 areas coming forward that will do their own local reviews, only Oldham said, yep, we'll do that. Then you look at some of the serious case reviews, they rarely talk about the perpetrators. And I thought, well, sod this, frankly. So these are victims and we need to do right by them. And if that takes a statutory inquiry, I'm going to go and get one for these girls.
Well, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has told MPs the findings are damning.
At its heart, she identifies a deep-rooted failure to treat children as children. A continued failure to protect children and teenage girls from rape, from exploitation and serious violence, and from the scars that last a lifetime. She finds too much fragmentation in the authorities' response, too little sharing of information, too much reliance on flawed data, too much denial, too little justice, too many criminals getting off, too many victims being let down.
Israel's president claims Iran was proceeding dramatically towards a nuclear bomb and there was no choice but to strike the country. Iran's UK ambassador argues its nuclear program was peaceful. As G7 leaders meet for talks in Canada, Donald Trump says Iran's not winning the war but claims it wants to talk about de-escalation. Here's Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
We agree with President Trump when he says negotiations are necessary and must lead to a deal.
A nursery worker filmed kicking one little boy in the face has been convicted of more than 20 counts of child cruelty. 22-year-old Roskana Lecker abused them at 2 nurseries between October 2023 and June last year. She'll be sentenced in September. A suspended Tory MP has denied 2 counts of sexual assault at a members' club in central London. 2 women claim the offences took place on one evening at Groucho in August 2023. 37-year-old Patrick Spencer, who represents Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, is due back in court next month. Number 10 says it has full confidence in Treasury Minister Emma Reynolds after she struggled to answer questions about the new Lower Thames crossing. It'll link Essex and Kent, but she was unclear about its location or cost when she spoke to LBC this morning.
Just remind listeners where the new crossing is, where it takes off and where it lands.
It's... you'll forgive me, I can't recall the exact landing zones.
So the crossing that you're talking about, you don't know where it is?
Well, it's the Lower Thames crossing.
Yes.
She was speaking to LBC to confirm another £590 million for the project. You can watch that exchange in full on the LBC app. And Britain's Dan Evans has advanced to the second round at Queen's Club. The 35-year-old shocked world number 13 Francis Tiafoe, beating him in straight sets. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 24 points at 88.75. The pound buys $1.35 and €1.17. LBC weather, spells of rain pushing eastwards across Scotland tonight, mainly dry and clear elsewhere, and a low of 9 degrees. From Global's newsroom, for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
And it's Simon Marks in for Ian Dale tonight and for the rest of this week. And delighted to be in the chair for this evening's edition of Cross Question. We do this on Ian's programme every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. An hour of open-ended conversation where you set the agenda. Whatever is on your mind, we will discuss in the hour ahead. On the panel tonight, I'm delighted to be with Brian Leishman, the Labour MP for Alloa and Grangemouth. Kit Malthouse, the Conservative MP for North West Hampshire. Martha Gill, columnist with The Observer. And Suzanne Evans, former Deputy Chair of UKIP, now the Director of the Public Affairs consultancy Political Insight. You can ask them anything you like. Maybe you want to find out their views on the conflict in the Middle East, the Prime Minister's efforts to finalise that trade agreement with the US on the fringes of the G7 in Canada. Perhaps you want to ask them about today's announcement by the Home Secretary story on grooming gangs. Maybe you'd like to know where they stand ahead of this Friday's Commons vote on assisted dying, or perhaps there's something else you want them to address. On Cross Question, it is your question that sets the agenda. You can call us now on 0345 6060 973. You can send questions to us on that number via WhatsApp or text us at 84850, or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC and ask your question that way. And because we're all too gorgeous for radio, you can even watch us live in full high definition right now on the LBC app.
Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app. This is LBC.
And my thanks to all four of our guests on the panel tonight. Let's go straight to the phone lines. And the first question this evening comes from Rob in Leeds. Rob, good evening.
Hi, Simon.
What would you like to ask the panel this evening?
Yeah, so it seems to me that the recent actions by the Israeli government against Iran has changed the conversation around how do we achieve peace in Gaza to how do we achieve regime change in Iran. Given the fact that that wasn't a question when the original conflict happened between Israel and Gaza, I'd like to know what regime change in Iran achieves. It doesn't seem to me that it works towards peace in the Middle East. There's no guarantee that a future Iranian regime would not have pursuit of nuclear weapons. And so I'd like to know what regime change in Iran actually achieves towards peace in the Middle East.
Brian Leishman, what's your view on Iran, Israel now absolutely pushing for regime change in Iran?
Well, I think we've got to look at this on a wider lens, and we've got to look at the actions of Israel over the last year and a bit and longer. We've seen the persecution, the oppression, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, and I'm certainly under no doubt that it's a genocide that is being committed against the Palestinian people. And what we've got to be looking at is, when we talk about regime change, we should be looking at exactly the war criminal and anti-human rights activities of Benjamin Netanyahu and his extremist government.
But the question is about regime change in Iran and Netanyahu now pushing for that. We spent the last hour discussing it on the programme. It is clearly now more of a possibility than it was a week ago. And Rob is asking, what would regime change achieve in Iran?
Well, what we've got to look at is the major destabilising forces at the moment in the Middle East, and have been for quite some time, has been the actions of Benjamin Netanyahu's government.
But what happens if, on this occasion, I'm not necessarily taking issue with that, but on this occasion, what happens if Netanyahu actually succeeds in getting rid of the mullahs?
Well, I'm looking at this from a wider regional aspect. And when we look at it from the wider regional aspect, we've got to look at the belligerent and truculent actions that Israel have performed over the last 18 months and more. We have to look at that from a human rights violation point of view. And I certainly disagree with the Prime Minister sending RAF jets over there. I think as what we've got to look at as a government, we've got to have a period of introspection. And actually, that's why I signed and co-sponsored the bill for a public inquiry into what's happened in Gaza.
I'm still not hearing what you think regime change in Iran might look like or might achieve.
I think what we've got to do is we've got to work in the notion of trying to achieve peace in the region, and that is through diplomacy, not through accelerated and escalating military action.
Why is it so hard for people on the left wing of politics to condemn the murderous regime that is Iran? I really don't understand, Brian. You know, ever since 1979 in the Iranian Revolution, Iran has descended into absolute hell. The majority of the people don't support the Ayatollahs. You look at images coming out of Iran when the Shah was leading Iran. I mean, obviously, you know, he was a flawed character. There's no doubt about that. But
a flawed character.
The Iranian Revolution, you know, on average now, they're killing 100 women a year, not just for not wearing the hijab, but because they're not wearing the hijab properly. This is a regime
why do some people, I'm going to come back with you, why do some people on the right of politics find it so difficult to pick and choose the battles in regard of human rights?
No,
what about
it's
the
not
human
about
rights that people
barrels.
in Gaza and West Bank are suffering from?
I have visited Israel. I've been to the West Bank, not to Gaza. I could talk at length about the persecution of the Palestinian people, but I don't see see why it is so hard, as I said, for people on the left not to condemn Iran. Why do you sit there and just refuse to say it's a dangerous terrorist regime that is exporting terrorism around the world? Its allies, its proxies are not the kind of people we want to get into bed with. Regime change, as Rob rightly said,
where do you think about being into bed then? Where do you stand in being in bed, as you put it, with what is happening with Benjamin Netanyahu's extremist government in regard of the UK selling arms to Israel? Do you approve of that?
Yes, I do, because Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and we have to protect
Where
that.
is
Because
democracy in the oppression and the persecution of Palestinian people?
We lose democracy, there becomes a massive threat to the rest of the world. And I go back to my original point. I just don't see why it's so hard for you to condemn the Iranian regime, which is quite clearly, when it comes to human rights, one of the worst, if not the worst, in the very world.
I want to keep this on Rob's question, which is and Rob is not a fan, from the sound of it, when he asked the question initially, of this concept of regime change. But Kip Malthouse, what would regime change achieve?
Well, I think what's the most worrying thing is we don't know, right? And as we've learned from other interventions in the Middle East, if you do effect regime change, what may come afterwards could be significantly worse.
Indeed.
And that is the concern. And so one of the most worrying things about what's happening at the moment, this exchange of missiles between the two, is that there doesn't seem to be an end game. Nobody really knows where it's going to go. It could end, and it seems that the Iranian, and I agree with Suzanne, revolting Iranian regime, I mean, what they do to their own people is appalling. They're not the only regime like that in the world, but still they are. But nevertheless, it feels, I mean, there's straws in the wind that they might be coming for a discussion about, suing for peace possibly, which is profoundly to be desired across the area. But my concern is about what is the kind of long-term prognosis here. From Libya, Iraq, Syria, right? We're talking about now an impact that may reverberate for decades and may reverberate beyond the region, as we've learned to our cost. And so this idea that there should be a kind of military action, forceful military action, which the Israelis have taken, without there being a political track to reach some kind of solution, or indeed without trying a political track first to its exhaustion, seems to me profoundly dangerous for us all. And I can't see, frankly, speaking parochially, how any of this is in the interest of the United Kingdom.
Arthur Gill.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely that this is a repressive regime, misogynistic, but as Kit Malthouse just said, the lesson is that, the fall of repressive regimes don't necessarily lead to a better outcome. One of the likely outcomes is fragmentation, which means, because there are so many different groups in that region, and then what that does is it means it's harder to hold anyone to account, although we have limited means to do that at the moment. You can't hold anyone to account, and terrorism then thrives. So that is a possible outcome. The other is that elements of the armed forces find it easiest to rise to the top. Whoever they bring with them will get to the top. There's of course, no guarantee that it'll be a liberal, Western-supporting government that succeeds.
I mean, this is just to add. I mean, this is also my concern. Is it's part of a wider game, and one of the things we raised in the House today in the statement was that this is very much moving the focus, as the question said, very much moving the focus off what is going on in Gaza. And, millions of people around the world saw footage last week of young boys shot, bleeding out their lives in the sand of Gaza. 50 people were killed or hospitalised over the weekend begging for food. And just this morning, 38 people shot as they went to try and get food aid, right? And so the whole world's focus has moved away from what's going on. The West Bank has gone into lockdown. So I wish Iran was a bright, shining light of democracy in the area and its young population could breathe free as it yearns to. My concern is that we're moving into a much more complicated and difficult game in which a number of defenseless civilians across the region, not least the Palestinians, may come out in much worse state than they already are.
OK, lively start to the hour. More of your questions to come on Cross Question. You can call us at 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp questions to that number or text us at 84850. The time on LBC Cross Question is 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
And Gordon has texted a question in at 84850. He asks, does the response of the Western powers to the degradation of Iran's nuclear weapons program by Israel not contain a large element of hypocrisy? Is Israel not just doing what everyone secretly wants to happen in Iran? Brian Leishman.
I think you've got to look at it from, as I said earlier on, from a UK perspective, and I would say that there is a large dose of hypocrisy. We continue to sell arms to Israel. They are being used against the people of Gaza. We are now talking about sending RAF jets over there in support of Israel. This is not a war that UK should be getting involved with.
But if the Israelis succeed in degrading Iran's nuclear capacity, even if there isn't regime change, if they just succeed in degrading Iran's nuclear capability, that is, for the UK, a win, isn't it?
I think as well we've got to have a look at, and we've actually got to, through the wider international community, appreciate and find out exactly what the uranium in Iran is being used for. Is it for non-weapon purposes as well? This is something that we've got to, the international community have got to fathom and find out.
But you can only find that out if the Iranians cooperate, and the IAEA last week absolutely indicated that they were not cooperating.
Well, I don't think we should be judging any country with double standards. When we look at that, Israel as well are participating in that exact same brinkmanship with the international community. And when we look at it as well, is there is one country in that region that do possess nuclear weapons and are adding to their arsenal. And when we look at the tens of thousands of people that have been killed, and the death and the destruction that they have wreaked havoc on in Gaza and in the West Bank, we've got to question exactly who has these weapons and for what purpose.
Suzanne Evans?
Well, Israel isn't intent on destroying half the Western world, which Iran is. It regularly chants death to America, death to Britain, death to Israel. Israel does not have the intention of causing nuclear Armageddon, which I'm afraid Iran does. And Kit, you asked earlier, you don't see what's in this for the UK. But I think if Iran's nuclear capacity can be wiped out, then that's not just a plus for the UK, it's a plus for the whole world, because I certainly wouldn't want to see this country get nuclear weapons, because God knows what it would do with them. It's absolutely terrifying. And that's why it's got to be stopped. And good on Israel for doing it. That's my view. And I think there is a lot of hypocrisy about people talking about we've got to de-escalate this, etc., etc. But if you've got any sense of decency in your body, you know that the Iranian regime is a wicked, evil one, and it has to end.
Kit Malthouse, what do you say to Gordon, who says, isn't Israel just doing what everyone secretly wants to see happen in Iran?
Well, that's certainly what some people said in the House of Commons today. They said that Israel was doing the world's dirty work in taking this out. And, Iran not getting nuclear weapons is profoundly to be pursued. I'm just not sure that lobbing missiles is the way to do it. If you remember, we had an agreement with the Iranians, which more or less they were complying with. President Trump cancelled that agreement in his last term. And since then, they haven't really played by the rules. As I say, my view on this is there's a kind of short-term view and then there's the kind of long-term view. And my concern is that in our interactions generally in the Middle East, we've thought about the short-term and ignored the long-term. So the idea that somehow this means the Iranians will give up trying to pursue nuclear weapons, I think is foolish. If anything, it will show them that they need some kind of ultimate defence for the future. In the same way, so I read somewhere in the paper the other day, it's strange how nobody ever attacks North Korea, who have nuclear weapons. And I think the Ukrainians, who were persuaded to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for a security guarantee, now might be thinking, well, hold on a minute, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation we are. So I worry about that nuclear proliferation generally across the world. I'm just not sure that this approach is the right way to manage it. Personally, from my point of view, one of the most distressing things about the whole conflict over the last 18 months or so has been the degrading of the notion that there should be a set of international rules and norms which we all adhere to and which we all enforce. And one of the things that we've repeatedly raised in the House of Commons, particularly about the conduct of Israel with regard to the Palestinians, is the fact that international law seems to have gone out of the window. And a set of rules which were devised post-Second World War entirely to avoid the kind of atrocities we saw in the Second World War, the bombing of civilians, the mass starvation, the use of siege effectively as a policy. That all seems to have been abandoned. And so when you project as Western powers, and we are powerful, as are the Americans, the idea that these rules don't apply anymore and there's a free-for-all, don't be surprised if countries that we don't like and aren't our friends take advantage of it.
Martha?
I agree. And of course, there's no guarantee that a war, even one that US joins, would necessarily be successful in wiping out the nuclear weapons programme.
Yeah, and we don't know how much damage has been done. I mean, we have no idea.
There's been some damage to some sites, relevant sites, but there seems to be a consensus among experts. I was reading up today that perhaps even a second attack would just delay the programme for a few months. There also seems to be a warning that, as Iran seeks to potentially defend itself, it might be able to cobble together sort of fashion a nuclear weapon out of the uranium that it already has to sort of some sort of dirty bomb, which is also a worry.
Terrifying. OK, let's go to our next question, and it's on the phone lines. It comes from Oliver, who is on the line from the Wirral. Good evening, Oliver. What's your question for the panel?
Oh, hello. Here is my question. Sorry, I didn't have your producer there. Here is my question. Given Yvette Cooper's statement to the House today, should Labour be in charge, and/or is Kemi Badenoch scraping the barrel? This in relation to the obvious.
When you say, Oliver, should Labour really be in charge? I mean, Labour is in charge. They're the government. Why are you suggesting that perhaps they shouldn't be?
Because your researcher just told me to rephrase my question to say it that way.
OK.
That's honest.
Well, Oliver is asking Brian Leishman about whether the government really does have the capacity, I think, to steer this investigation, this inquiry, given that you heard the Home Secretary today say that we've lost a decade in terms of what should have been going on with addressing these grooming gangs. One of those 10 years has been since Labour came to power. So I think what Oliver might be getting at is whether Labour really can be trusted with overseeing all of this going forwards.
Well, I think what Oliver's saying there as well is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Oliver, as well, is that Oliver is one of these millions of people across the United Kingdom that voted for change last July in a whole multitude and a whole raft of issues. And I can understand and I can sympathise with Oliver's disgruntlement and impatience for change, because that's really what we should be delivering now that we're in government, and we are 1 year in. In regard of the grooming gangs, I think it was the right decision to have a national inquiry.
So why did you vote against one then?
I voted against one because in the Children and Wellbeing Bill from, I think it was January time, it was basically one Conservative opposition amendment against it, which would have defeated the entire bill, which also, I have to say, had an element from the Jay report, which, and I'm not going to throw mud at the previous Conservative government, because to be quite frank, that's not going to benefit the victims. And I think that that's exactly what we've got to have a look at, is the victims and also the bringing the perpetrators to justice. So I'm not going to be here in point scoring on Conservative inaction over the last decade or more. But that's why it was, because that Children and Wellbeing Bill had a measurement in it to enact a finding from the Jay report that would have got would have allowed children to identify an adult from the inquiry.
Martha Gill, I see that Yvette Cooper, in introducing Baroness Casey's report today, indicated that there had been failure across the board by politicians, lawmakers, police, prosecutors, society writ large. We have seen a Labour U-turn today, at least on this issue of the national inquiry. Is, as Oliver asks, the Labour government really the best vessel for pursuing all of this?
Well, as opposed to a different future government I mean, there's been, as you've just said, there was failure across the board, across lawmakers, police, specifically, I think, about recording data on this group of perpetrators, which was sort of shied away from because of their ethnicity and so that is why we need a further inquiry. As you just alluded to, the previous government didn't, none of the 200 recommendations by a previous report into sexual abuse by Professor Alexis Jay were adopted by the then government. And so it's clear that something needs to be done about that, and that according to the review today by Louise Casey, further inquiry needs to be made on the basis of filling in the gaps in the data.
Kit Malthouse, a lot of this inaction, most of this inaction, took place on the watch of Conservative Party governments.
Well, I think that, to be honest, in truth, I think that's a bit unfair. It was Theresa May who set up the ICSA inquiry, the child sexual abuse inquiry, which was covering this area as well. And it took a long time. And there is, I do think one of the issues we have to face, whether it's this or the Post Office or other inquiries, is they do take a long time to reach some kind of conclusion. The gangs task force was set up in 2023 once the thing had concluded. 4,000 extra victims were identified, 807 arrests, investigations in Rotherham and Telford and elsewhere. So, while it was slow, and I think part of that was waiting for the inquiry to conclude, nevertheless, there was action that took place. And I think, to be honest with you, it was post the inquiry concluding and post the revelation about these extra victims and these arrests that the kind of impetus came for a national inquiry. And what was alarming was the kind of inflexibility of the government towards saying, do you know what, actually, this is revealing itself as a huge scandal across the country. The picture that's emerging is a horrific one. We've got lots of victims who've been campaigning for ages. Let's have a public inquiry. And the concern was, of course, is that what people say is it's been infected by politics, right? That a lot of these areas are controlled by a particular political party, by the Labour Party, and therefore there's some, shall we say, hesitancy about necessarily opening up all the books. Now, thankfully, Louise Casey, who is a very robust individual, has said, look, you've got to get into this. So let's get it done as fast as we possibly can.
But do you regret, given what we learnt today about the failure to keep data, about the ethnicity of the men who participate in these grooming gangs, given that has become such a political lightning rod in the UK, and there is no data to help resolve that argument?
You see, I don't think that's true. So when Sajid Javid was Home Secretary, he did mandate the collection of ethnicity data around the victims.
She said today that 2/3 of those men accused of being involved in grooming gangs, there is no data relating to their ethnicity.
Well, you'd have to ask Sajid and have to ask the Home Office about why the data was incomplete. But nevertheless, it's on record.
I haven't got them here tonight.
Well, I know. But if I'd known, I didn't see. He's not a parliamentarian. Didn't get a hold of him today. But you'd have to ask.
Some of this on your party? It's got to have been on your party.
Some of it is, as I say, it was slow. Theresa May set up the ICSA inquiry under Alexis Jay. It took a long time to work its way through the various issues. But once it concluded, as far as I can see, I was a minister at the time in 2023, they acted quickly, the gangs task force, off we went. But nevertheless, we are where we are. And I guess the issue for the leadership of my party and for our party generally was why say no? Why, when I was in government, the Labour Party spent a long time calling for inquiries into lots of things, right? And many of them we said, great, whether it's infected blood or the Post Office. And there is an issue about how long these inquiries take. But what we couldn't understand was, given the scale of this and the nature of the victimisation and the problem that was emerging in towns up and down the country, why Labour just wouldn't say, do you know what, actually, this is a slam dunk case for an inquiry. We got there in the end.
Suzanne?
It's fascinating, isn't it, how in modern life, ethnicity is everything. We've all filled in all sorts of forms and we have to state our ethnicity. And yet, funnily enough, in this particular issue, suddenly it doesn't matter. And I think this is on the Labour Party partly as well, because let's not forget that an inquiry was absolutely refused. And then there was huge pressure. We even went to the point, remember Lucy Powell, the Labour MP, called it a dog whistle. People asking for this inquiry were a dog whistle. What she said was appalling, but then the next day she sat on the front bench alongside Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions. And I'm with kind of Oliver on this, really. I don't think I do trust Labour on this issue, not at all. However, it's not really going to be up to the Labour government to do the inquiry. Hopefully it will be independent and it will, I hope, expose not just the extent of the criminality involved, but the people who covered it up. And that's what makes me angry. The people, the police, the social workers, the politicians, the people who covered this up and left those girls to rot and didn't believe them, called them prostitutes, called them sex workers. And one of the things I think is primary importance of Louise Casey's report today is that she's saying that if adults engage in sex with children under 16, they must face charges of rape. It is statutory rape, and that has long been forgotten. It's almost become legalised, and we've got to get back to that idea that you have sex with a child, you're a rapist.
Let me ask you a follow-up question that we've received from Barry in Huddersfield, and just because of the time, I'm going to ask you if you can be brief in your answers. But Barry is asking about accountability. What would represent justice for the victims of the systemic abuse of grooming gangs? Do we need the bosses of councils and police forces involved to go to jail? Brian Leishman.
I think we need to certainly have this investigation, have this inquiry, and then if there are criminal charges that are to be brought after that, then people should be facing up to those charges.
Absolutely.
Martha Gill?
It's very difficult to, by the means of an inquiry, to kind of prove criminal activity, particularly within an organisation, specific individuals. So I very much doubt that will happen. But it's clear that something needs to change in that respect, and they need to be held accountable. I'm personally not sure what the mechanism might be to do that. It's not this inquiry, but I would be very open to suggesting I think that's a good idea.
Kit Malthouse?
Yes, they should. And I think that one of the problems we've got with our model of inquiry is that the British people are losing faith because no one ever is held accountable, whether it's the post office or, in fact, no one ever goes to prison for some really heinous crimes. Now, that's beyond the perpetrators, but if there is proven attempts to cover up or manipulate or to avoid scrutiny, then there should be consequences. Of course there should.
And Suzanne?
I think I've made my feelings clear, absolutely.
OK. More of your questions to come on Cross Question. We're going to be taking them all the way through until 9 o'clock. You can call in at 0345 6060973 or text 84850 or send your question to us by asking Alexa to send a comment to LBC. At 33 minutes past 8, the news headlines now come from Daryl Jackson.
The Home Secretary's told MPs the findings of a review into grooming gangs are damning. The report by Baroness Casey revealed there was collective failure to address questions about the group's ethnicities. Israel's president claims Iran was proceeding dramatically towards a nuclear bomb as he claims there was no choice but to strike the country. As world leaders meet in Canada, Donald Trump says Iran's not winning the war, but claims it wants to talk about de-escalation. A nursery worker has been found guilty of 21 counts of child cruelty over an 8-month period, including kicking a toddler in the face in West London. Roxana Lecker, who's 22, will be sentenced in September. LBC weather: spells of rain pushing eastwards across Scotland tonight, dry elsewhere and a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC.
yourself.
Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
Which is what Loretta has done in Billingborough in Lincolnshire, and she wants to ask about the assisted dying bill and the vote in the House of Commons this coming Friday. She says, how can supporters of assisted dying trust their wishes will come true if passed, seeing as the bill has already changed so much since the start of this whole thing? And let me go first of all to Kit Malthouse, because Kit, you are a co-sponsor of the bill.
I am. Well, once the House of Commons sets the bill in stone, it's been very tightly drawn. The government's got up to 4 years to kind of implement it, and that includes putting in place all the structures, the training, the new Assisted Dying Commission headed by a High Court judge or equivalent. So it will be some time before the first person is able to avail themselves of that incredibly valuable service if they want it. And given the way the bill has progressed over the last, 6 months, I am pretty confident that what we've got is easily the tightest legislation in the world. And this is a service that's offered in numerous countries around the world now. And so, I'm confident that we'll be able to produce a service which is sensitive to our own cultural sensibilities, but provides dying people with the service that they want.
Are you confident about the outcome of the vote?
I am, yes. I mean, I think we've shown in every round so far that the majority is holding fairly strong. Certainly, proportionately, our majority was the same last Friday. And we haven't seen any significant shift there's been 2 or 3 people either way, but we haven't seen any kind of big shift either way on the bill. So, we're obviously not being complacent, and every member is looking at every stage again and again and again, as you would expect with something as profound as this. But my general sense is that the momentum is for it to pass,
And because you're here tonight, I wanted to ask you about this letter that 50 Labour members of Parliament have sent to the Leader of the House, saying that the bill is now so long that there should be more time allowed for debate around it.
Yeah, this is a line that's been pushed by opponents of the bill for some time now. But in fact, this bill has had more scrutiny than most government bills. We're I think, well over 100 hours in terms of scrutiny now. We've had 2 days of report stage, which most government bills don't get. We did, I think, 80 or 90 hours in committee, which is way more than others get. And, of course, we were the first private members' bill in history to take oral evidence, which private members' bill don't normally do. So I just don't think it stands up to reason. If you talk to somebody like the Hansard Society, who are the kind of, independent monitors of what happens in Parliament, they would say this just doesn't stand up to any kind of scrutiny. We've had a lot of time. And to be fair to Kim, when there has been a committee stage where people said we need more time or we need time to contemplate the evidence, she's expanded. But opponents have been running a series of arguments. One of them has been about this process issue. But we're going to third reading on Friday. We'll see what the House of Commons decides.
Brian Leishman, Loretta's question is, how can supporters of assisted dying trust their wishes will come true if the bill is passed, seeing as it has already changed so much since the beginning of this process?
There's no doubt about it that the bill has changed significantly. I voted in the first reading. I voted against. What I will say is I have had an awful lot of constituent correspondence on it, and I'm sympathetic to both sides. I can only explain my own reasoning. My own reasoning is that I do still worry about some vulnerable people being put in the position. And I also, as well as I'm going to relate it to something else that is coming up this week, and that is the proposed welfare reforms. And what we've seen is over the last decade and a half of really, really brutal austerity that has impoverished people and created some desperation amongst people. I really do fear that there'll be some people that might be impacted to think that that is perhaps a route out of their immiseration. So that's why I will not be supporting it.
It is Monday. Can anything happen between now and Friday to change your mind?
No, I've made up my mind.
No.
Yeah, hard no, but with complete and utter respect for both sides of the debate. And what I will say as well is, after sitting in the chamber and listening to parliamentary colleagues from both sides on all parties, it's been conducted in a great deal of respect, which I think is a credit and shows that politics can actually be a force for good and, dare I say at times, civil.
Suzanne Evans.
I would be voting with Brian on this one if I were a Member of Parliament. I really don't like this bill. I think the goalposts have changed significantly. I'm sure you've had a lot of letters from your constituents, Brian. There's a very strong lobby pushing for this. I think it's very worrying. I totally agree with what we were saying. People who feel desperate, who don't want to be a burden, will be pushed down a route. I think it's very interesting that Esther Ranson, one of the people that was supporting this, suddenly found she got longer to live than she thought she had. And the bill, you never quite know. I've got a very good friend who was given 2 years to live 10 years ago. You can never be quite sure what's going to happen. I've also been to the funeral today of a dear friend who died after a very short illness, unexpected. Life is always hangs on goes on the turn of a screw, as it were. I'm worried about the motivation of some of the people pushing this. And Kit, I'm going to single you out. I was very worried when you said that we should defund hospices that refuse to do
I didn't say that.
Well, that's how you've been reported.
Yeah, well, you're watching too much social media, Suzanne. That's not what I said at all.
Maybe I am, but I think there has been a lot of discussion around this, which, yes, has been respectful in part. But I think to turn the NHS into a kind of state-sponsored suicide organisation is deeply worrying.
That's not correct.
I think the funeral you attended today was for Patrick O'Flynn, who were former cross-question guest.
Yes,
so
indeed.
Condolences on that. Martha Gill, Loretta wants to know how supporters of assisted dying can trust their wishes will come true, given that this bill has changed.
Well, I think trust is the operative word, given that the bill has changed so much and the goalposts have shifted. I'm afraid I'm not on your side of the debate here. I think the worry is the difficulty of maintaining safeguards once the structures and apparatus have been set up for the state to kill people. We also know that when people are exposed to suicide, they are more likely to commit suicide. That is the basis on which websites are shut down. Rails are put along bridges. And if this is brought up as an option, people are more likely to feel suicidal. So I think there's the fact that this was a private member's bill may have been sufficient for debate in Parliament, but it means the UK is having a less detailed discussion that it might have had had it gone through a different way. I don't think the rest of the country has had a big enough debate about this very, very important issue.
Just some fundamental misunderstandings, both about the process and about what it's like to be told that you are dying. Right, having over the last 10 years of campaigning spent a lot of time with dying and bereaved people, you come to understand the awful choices that they face and what it's like to live the last 6 months of your life. But just in terms of process, it's right that the bill has changed significantly, but in the light of evidence, right, the bill took evidence that the bill could be stronger, and it has been strengthened. And indeed, there was an amendment went through to strengthen it on Friday. So, the likelihood is that more people may look at it now and say, this is stronger than it was at second reading, we will support. But the key thing to remember, I think, and certainly for Brian and Suzanne, well, not Suzanne is voting, but Brian is voting, is that if you are voting against the bill, you are voting for the status quo, right? And at the moment, the status quo is a horror story for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people every year, right? We have 600 or 700 people who are taking their own lives in desperate, lonely circumstances because they think they have no other choice. We've got one person a week going to Switzerland, business class, because they can afford it, because they think they have no other choice. And my worry is that unless you've been through it, and I hope none of you have, and I hope none of you ever will, you fail to understand the fear that grips people when you have a disease like MND or Huntington's disease or one of those awful diseases about what your death is going to be like. And one of the most valuable things we hear from people who are dying, and even people who are bereaved but have lived with somebody who was dying, who's gone to Switzerland or whatever, is that the liberation from fear, that knowing you have the card in your back pocket, is enormous. Right, that you can make the most of your last few months because you're not frightened of what your final few days are going to be like. And while to address the final point I want to say is to address this point about Esther Ranson longevity. Thank God she's lived longer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, but what happens is, the way the system works is somebody applies, gets permission to do this, and then they have the choice. And it's for them to decide the time, place, and manner of their own death, knowing that their death is inevitable. And notwithstanding your language, Martha, we are talking about not shortening life, but shortening death. And for many, many people, death is a protracted, painful, unpleasant process. And we just want to give them the choice.
Let me just say to listeners and viewers, if you have been troubled by anything that you've heard over the past few minutes, don't forget that you can always contact the Samaritans at any time of the day or night, completely free. You can call 116 123, or you can email Joe, that's J-O, at samaritans.org. I want to come back to Brian briefly, because you mentioned welfare reform in your response to this question. And the Prime Minister said yesterday, everybody agrees that the welfare system has got to be reformed, and that is what we intend to do. And he made it pretty clear that he's not going to be listening to people that he would consider rebels within the Labour Party like yourself over this. How far are you prepared to go? Will you risk losing the whip over a vote on welfare reform if it comes to that?
I couldn't go home and look at my friends and my family and my constituency Labour parties, I've got 2 of them in my constituency, and be a Labour Party member. I couldn't go back to these people and look them in the eye and say that I voted for these welfare reforms. Because what we really do need to do, we absolutely, let me just say, firstly, people working, absolutely, I'm all for that. But this notion that we can incentivise people to work that just, to be honest, cannot work because of their disability, that is a ridiculous notion. And frankly, it's cruel. What we've got to do is, we do absolutely have to look at our welfare system. But what we've got to do is, we've got to work with disability organisations, disability charities, the people that work on the front line of these issues, people with this lived experience, and listen to their needs. And we've got to try and transform the welfare system to try and eradicate poverty, not change the welfare system and actually put people into poverty. And that absolutely should never be the work of any Labour government.
So you'll go to the mat over it?
I'm not voting for these welfare reforms.
OK. More questions to come on Cross Question. We're going to be talking with our panel until the top of the hour. The time now is 12 minutes to 9.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
Back to the phone lines. Charles has called us with a question from Hull tonight. Charles, I think your question is rooted in events on the other side of the Atlantic.
It is indeed. Good to be on your show, Simon, once more, by the way.
Lovely to be on with you, Charles, on Ian's show. I am merely a guest for the purposes of this evening. What's your question, though, for the panel?
Hello, panel. It's this question. Was the Donald Trump parade on Saturday a humiliation or a vindication for changing the United States for the better?
Martha Gill, was Donald Trump's military parade a triumph or a humiliation?
Well, it was slightly overshadowed by protests, wasn't it? It wasn't quite the display of pomp and might that he could have hoped for. So I think probably out of those two choices, I'd lean towards the humiliation side.
Was also significantly overshadowed by that awful political violence in Minnesota.
Indeed, and political violence seems to be escalating in America. There was Pennsylvania governor's house was set on fire in the last 3 months. The Republican Party headquarters in Mexico was also set on fire. Protesters have been gunned down, and some people are saying that Trump hasn't helped that because, of course, one of his first acts was pardoning the rioters, and he's previously encouraged people at his rallies to knock the hell out of protesters. So this was a bit of an uneasy confluence of events.
Suzanne Evans, humiliation or vindication?
Well, my understanding is that Trump is absolutely disconsolate about it, which rather suggests that he himself thinks it was something of a humiliation, does it not?
I think it almost certainly does. Brian Leishman.
Humiliation for me, and it showed really the sort of, I think, the egomania that the man possesses. And I think to look at it again, as I said earlier on about an earlier question about a wider context, the sort of bravado and the over-the-topness of him, I think, is definitely a humiliation.
I mean, Kit Malthouse, there were so many extraordinary images that day, but the one that I can't get past is the picture of the member of the US Armed Forces parading past Donald Trump carrying a drone. I mean, it was bizarre.
There was an element of that. The thing I couldn't quite get my head around was that none of them could march.
Well, that as well.
And so I watched the whole thing and thought, you know what? No one does a military parade quite like the British.
Well,
right?
Do you think
after trooping the colour the other day with those splendid guardsmen, somehow we managed to do a military parade without appearing militaristic.
But do you think they can't march?
Seems to be the trick to pull off.
Do you think they can't march, or they just couldn't be bothered to march?
I don't think they quite have the same. Having been in the CCF at school and spent hours and hours and hours doing drill in the parade ground, I don't think they quite have our predilection for marching. Perhaps. So I thought it was a very odd thing to do. And, you know, Western democracies don't generally parade their hardware in that way, in a sort of North Korean type adulatory way. And so it was always going to be a slightly bizarre event. But yeah, the fact that they couldn't quite pull it off made me proud of our guardsmen.
OK, Charles, thanks for the call. Penultimate question of the night before our final question of the evening, and it comes from Martin in Doncaster. Good evening, Martin.
Hiya, panel. Yeah, my question is when families are struggling to put food on the table, how can MPs justify spending £10 million on a door for the House of Lords and it doesn't work?
OK, and just to explain to people who may be unfamiliar with this story, £9.6 million has been spent on a security upgrade to the Piers entrance to the parliamentary estate over the last 2 years, but it is still not working properly for disabled members of the House of Lords, so a member of staff is required at all times to open and close the door for them. And in 2022, it was estimated that the cost of refurbishing the entire parliamentary estate could reach £22 billion and take 76 years to be completed. Brian Leishman, Martin's question, families unable to put food on the table. How can you justify spending that kind of money on the parliamentary estate?
You cannot justify it. We've got to look at the gross inequality that we have across the United Kingdom. And when we look at the last 14 years, we have had pretty much, number one, austerity. Policy by design to immiserate communities. And then on the back of that, we've seen gross inequality and the wealth inequality of the country from the COVID pandemic, where the richest really did accelerate away from people that were struggling to get by. And then the third thing in that unholy trinity is the cost of living crisis, which is still raging on. Because when we just look at it in isolation about energy bills, what we've seen is complete impotence from Ofgem. last October. I think we saw a 10% increase, and then in the new year, in January, we saw a 1% and a bit increase. I think it was 1.4%, and then it was just over 6% in April, and that is just for energy bills. What we've got to do is we've got to make people better off, and the real route to getting a second term of a Labour government, and the real route to defeating opponents such as Reform is by improving people's living standards. And that means old-fashioned, dare I say, old-fashioned Labour policies of redistributing wealth and power across society.
Kit Malthouse. Martin in Doncaster says, how can you spend 10 million quid on a new door which doesn't work for the House of Lords at a time when you've got families unable to put food on the table?
It's unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable incompetence to do this. And I have no idea how they managed to do it. I mean, to be honest with you, it almost needs, I'm sorry, after what I said, a mini inquiry into how they managed to cock it up. I mean, look, the House of Commons is the Palace of Westminster is a Grade 1 listed building. It's been neglected for decades, is absolutely falling down, as you will have seen. You know, at one end we've got scaffolding because bits of masonry keep falling onto the public. They've done a fantastic job on Big Ben over the last, 6 years. It was under scaffolding. It looks fantastic now. So there's got to be some maintenance programme. But on a door, 9.5 million quid. And here's an example. Whoever spec'd that should be looking for other work.
Sounds like you need a bit of Elon Musk in here, Suzanne Evans.
Well, I have to say, I walked past it to get to the studio, and it is the most beautiful door.
Well, it should be.
Absolutely. But that cost astronomical. But I think what annoys me more than anything is this, I tell you now, is just the very tip of a very big iceberg. The waste that goes on at national, local government is absolutely horrifying. I've seen it as a local councillor just in one London borough. It's the same. You know, the way in which the public sector spends taxpayers' money is absolutely revolting, and this is just the tip of the iceberg.
But you managed not to use the acronym Doge. Martha Gill.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the tip of the other iceberg is, of course, we mentioned earlier, the parliamentary estate, which is actually falling apart to the point of being quite dangerous. A fire risk, there's asbestos in there, there's rats running all over the place. At some point, you do need to do something about it, but it's sort of this mounting problem because, of course, it will cost a lot of money. It will cause a lot of problems politically to do that. And so I guess we're just waiting for some sort of disaster to enable it to happen.
Fun question of the night. And it comes from Oscar in Harlow. The singer Vanessa Hernandez, he says, sung a Spanish version of the US national anthem at a baseball match in Los Angeles on Saturday as part of a protest. Meanwhile, the former UK Eurovision star Sam Ryder performed God Save the King with an electric guitar at the rugby at Twickenham. Which other celebrity would you like to see performing their national anthem next? And I know Kit Malthouse can't wait for a chance to answer this question.
It's so obscure a question. I have no idea. Look, I'm married to a Canadian. I like Michael Bublé, him singing the Canadian. But you know what I'd actually like, in all seriousness, and it might sound a bit touchy-feely, but I'd love to hear a series of celebrities from across the Middle East all singing their own national anthems in peace, right? I think, and that includes the Palestinians, who should have their own country. And if we could get to that, they had their own version of Eurovision and they all got on singing like everybody else does in Europe, then that would be quite something for the world to see.
Don't want to see Boris Johnson singing the national anthem?
Oh my God, I've heard him sing. That's the last thing you want to hear.
Brian Leishman.
Fun question, fun answer. I'm going to go back to my previous profession. I was a golf professional.
Were you really?
Yeah, that was my route into Parliament. I was a golf professional for 23, nearly 24 years. And I had the pleasure of working at Gleneagles. And for a week, I taught Shakira.
Oh.
So,
get out.
I have to say, for a complete beginner, a novice, total novice, by the end of the week, she was excellent. I'm not going to take the credit for that because it was my teaching. I think she just had a bit of ability anyway. So I'm going to go for Shakira and whatever the Colombian national anthem is.
Have you stayed in touch?
No.
She went out with Simon Cowell, didn't she? I seem to remember.
Did she?
I got that right. Have I got that right?
I don't think so.
Maybe I'm thinking of somebody else.
I think there was a footballer in there somewhere.
Gerard Piqué.
Yeah.
Was her husband for a while.
Yeah, that's right.
I have not followed her oeuvre sufficiently, clearly. Suzanne Evans, your choice of celebrity.
Well, it's a tricky one, this, but I don't think I need a choice because I've already heard Nigel Farage sing the national anthem. He's very good. He's got a beautiful voice, so I'm content.
Has he?
Gorgeous voice, yeah. He sings very well.
Martha Gill?
I'm a big fan of Kate Bush. I'd love to know what she makes of the national anthem in her strange, ethereal way.
That would be very good, wouldn't it? Well, we'll see which celebrity decides to sing a national anthem next. My thanks to all of you for being on the panel tonight. I'm enormously grateful to you and to everybody for calling and texting in questions. We were joined tonight by Brian Leishman, Labour MP for Alloa and Grangemouth, Kit Malthouse, the Conservative MP for North West Hampshire, Martha Gill, columnist with The Observer, and Suzanne Evans, former Deputy Chair of UKIP, now the Director of the Public Affairs consultancy Political Insight. Tomorrow's panel consists of Praful Nargand, a Labour councillor in Islington and director of the Good Growth Foundation think tank, Claire Hanna, the leader of the Northern Irish SDLP, the Conservative Party political advisor Kirsty Buchanan, and one more lucky guest whose identity we will reveal tomorrow. That's Cross Question for this evening. Into our next hour together, and we're going to talk about grooming gangs and Yvette Cooper's dramatic announcements, plural, earlier in the Commons.
Stretching back decades, organisations who should have protected children and punished offenders looked the other way.
She revealed that the law has failed to see children as children, that data on the ethnicity of grooming gang members is inadequate, and suggested politicians and policymakers had failed over many years to embrace questions about whether specific ethnic groups are overly responsible for the crimes grooming gangs commit. Months after the government dismissed calls for a national inquiry, she launched one. It could take 3 years to conclude. Can we wait that long as a society to sort this out and combat grooming gangs once and for all?
Radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Sir Keir Starmer's rejected claims he's been dragging his heels over a public inquiry into grooming gangs. The Conservatives say he didn't need to wait for a report that's found victims were let down by authorities before announcing the review. The party's leader, Kemi Badenoch, wants an apology.
He and the Home Secretary dismissed calls for an inquiry because they did not want to cause a stir. They accused those of us demanding justice for the victims of this scandal as, and I quote, jumping on a far-right bandwagon.
Rochdale MP Sarah Champion told LBC she blames middle and upper management for failures to prosecute grooming gangs.
There are also people who get paid quite a lot of money to make the decisions that should be protecting our children. And I think if they were involved in obstructing justice, they need to be held account. Maybe it's not a criminal threshold, but there should be some sort of professional action that's taken against them, or just naming and shaming. You know, I don't want people that let child abuse go on their watch still be working in a similar industry.
The Foreign Secretary has urged Israel and Iran to show restraint as the conflict between the two countries continues to escalate. Israel's president says it had no choice but to strike Iran as it was proceeding dramatically towards a nuclear weapon. Iran says its infrastructure is legitimate. A nursery worker has been convicted of 21 counts of child